A few more familiar classics to round out the 7800's early days on this episode of NES Works Gaiden. One more classic Namco arcade conversion? Ah heck, why not? This is also the last classic Namco arcade conversion for 7800. The system and Namco had a pretty good run together, but it all ends here with the November 1986 release of classic Xevious. As with the other Namco ports we've seen, Xevious' development team is uncredited in official sources, but this conversion is believed to have been handled by General Computer Corp. And like those other releases, it is by far the most convincing conversion of the game yet to have been seen on an American console in 1986. Of course, there would be a superior version released by Bandai alongside Galaga in September of 1988, but at the time of this game's launch for 7800, that version was still stranded in Japan, where pretty much no one in the US was aware of it. What we were aware of were the very rocky adaptations Atari and others had published for platforms like Commodore 64, Atari 5200, and tragically even the 2600. Those conversions were, not to put too fine a point on it, kinda bad. Xevious for 7800, on the other hand, is not bad. Much like Galaga, it does stumble over some fine details, but compared to what had come before, this was practically like having a real arcade machine in your home. While the NES version would nail the look, sound, and gameplay of the coin-op original far more faithfully, that was almost 2 years away at this point. Advantage? Atari. I don't know that anyone's metric for investing in a new console in 1986 was how well it played Xevious, but there had to have been someone out there who felt that way. And for them, this release was essentially killer app caliber. There are some minor annoyances about this version of the game. One of the big innovations that Namco brought to the shooter genre with this classic arcade release of this game was the idea of dual weapons and dual targeting. Solvalu Fighter could fire a Zapper, its twin forward cannons, and its Blaster, a fixed-range bomb. Aerial enemies could only be hit with the Zapper, while ground-based enemies had to be targeted with the Blaster, whose impact point was indicated by a crosshair reticle set directly ahead of the Solvalu. You could also use the Blaster to destroy ground emplacements such as pyramids and cannons, and a very attentive player could also fire a bomb when the reticle flashed red over seemingly empty ground to reveal hidden secrets. Although the game's action plays out through a strictly top-down viewpoint, there's never any ambiguity about which enemies are airborne and which move along the ground. The design and behavior of your opponents makes the distinction perfectly intuitive. Airborne enemies move quickly and freely, while terrestrial foes tend to move more slowly and are always restricted to the road system that sprawls across the surface. But both types of foes can and will fire freely at your fighter, meaning they pose a threat to you regardless, though only airborne opponents can collide with your Solvalu. All of this carries across into the 7800 version, but bizarrely this adaptation doesn't make use of one of the system's most critical features, its 2-button joystick. As with previous console ports of Xevious, the buttons here are redundant, and each one fires both the Blaster and the Zapper at the same time. While there's something to be said for not having to make a conscious effort to bomb ground-based targets, Xevious loses something when you don't have fine control over which weapon you fire. The Blaster is meant to be more of a tactical weapon than the Zapper, but here you use them indiscriminately, which often means you have to avoid firing at flying enemies in order to land a precise blaster strike at the right moment. It's a minor issue, but it disrupts the flow of the game. So too does the slightly off-kilter enemy timing. Flying foes don't interact with you here precisely as they did in the arcade game, forcing you to relearn some of your combat strategies. You can see this in action right away, as firing at foes that peel away from your ship once they cross your line of fire typically results in missed shots here. In the arcade and NES versions, zapping an airborne foe as it crosses in front of you will allow you to rack up tons of consecutive hits, but here the same actions will simply result in enemies that dodge your fire and escape safely. There are also some minor visual shortcomings to be found here, like the way the Nazca lines are more like Nazca chunks. But again, minor issues. These small annoyances don't ruin the game, they just make it feel a little shabby with 30 plus years of hindsight. On the whole though, Xevious on 7800 hits all the important points of the game. Not only does it preserve the dual altitude combat, it also does a solid job of recreating Xevious' dynamic difficulty levels. The endless scroll of the world features specific enemy encounters at set locations, but these opponents are supplemented by variable enemies that grow in ferocity the longer you manage to play without dying. The enemy's ships and ground vehicles each come with their own distinct sets of behavior. You face everything from spinning ring ships that skitter away the moment they enter your zapper's line of fire, to indestructible slabs of metal, to the deadly and/or Genesis flagships that pepper you with projectiles and then dash to safety if you don't manage to place a bomb right in their core quickly enough. It's a varied, engrossing shooter that essentially launched the genre beyond the static screens of Space Invaders and Galaxian and into the modern world. And if you're curious to know what it's like to see the game through expert eyes, the adjustable difficulty setting allows you to tweak the game so that the deadliest and most aggressive enemies swarm you right from the start. In short, a very respectable conversion of the game, if not quite up to the standards set by Namco's in-house NES adaptation a few years later, but certainly enough to prove the 7800 could more than hold its own. And that would be it for the 7800 for quite a while. It would be 9 months between Xevious and its next retail release, kicking off a line of home computer conversions to complement the arcade conversions we'd been seeing to this point. The first of these microcomputer conversions would be Dan Gorlin and Bruderbund's Choplifter. I guess technically you could consider Choplifter an arcade conversion, since it was one of a handful of American computer releases that Japanese arcade manufacturers licensed to turn into coin-ops. Choplifter doesn't seem to have achieved the same action game resonance as its peers like Lode Runner and Pitfall 2, and it faded from the public eye far more quickly than those games. So we'll call this a computer conversion, and indeed Choplifter on Atari 7800 hews pretty closely to the Apple II original, albeit with nicer graphics. You control a military rescue copter sent out to save a small army of prisoners of war from a series of bases in enemy territory. While you're armed with a chin turret that can fire a single projectile at a time, offense really isn't the name of this particular game. This is a mercy mission as you try to load your helicopter full of hostages and ferry them safely back to your base. Clearly inspired by the current events of the early 80s, the Iran hostage crisis and the ongoing political infighting over MIAs in Vietnam, Choplifter didn't seem quite so timely by the time this port rolled around in 1986. It still played well though, and while this was hardly the first TV adaptation of the game, the 7800 conversion absolutely demolished any other port available on the American home console market at the time, in terms of both appearances and gameplay. This take on Choplifter is ultimately a brief game. You're given 3 choppers with which to sortie out and attempt to retrieve MIAs. There are 5 enemy bases, each of which houses more than a dozen prisoners, and your chopper can hold 15 civilians at a time. In abstract terms, you want to blow open a prison, land, and let MIAs dash to your chopper, then tote them back home to your base's landing pad. In concrete terms, the game is never so straightforward. The little people you need to tote to safety are tragically squishy and vulnerable. If you're not careful where you land, you'll crush them. If an enemy tank fires at you and hits an MIA, the poor escapee will be instantly vaporized. And if your helicopter goes down under enemy fire while loaded with civvies, well, that's up to 15 deaths on your conscience. All you need to do to beat Choplifter is escort a total of 60 civilians back to your base. Though this is more easily said than done. Tanks will crawl onto the screen lobbing projectiles at you while you load up your rescuees. After you complete a trip or two, enemy jets will scramble at random, unexpectedly appearing on screen before launching a bomb, and giving you about a second of reaction time to dodge to safety, even if you're sitting motionless on the ground. There are also strange jellyfish-like weather balloons that hover over enemy bases, difficult to target, yet fully capable of messing up your chopper. It's a fast and unforgiving game. To balance out the challenge level a bit, your chopper can face in 3 different directions and move freely in all directions, regardless of your current orientation. This allows you to move around to avoid hazards while firing in a specific direction, a bit like Robotron 2084's dual-stick controls. But much simpler. While it can be a vexing game thanks to its tendency to throw fatal danger your way without warning, Choplifter is a legitimate classic, and this is a very good conversion. Admittedly, the 9-month gap between Xevious and this didn't do this game or its host platform any favors. When Xevious debuted, it held its own quite nicely against the closest thing the NES had to offer, the awful Micronix port of 1942, but the NES soldiered on, never taking a break. By the time Choplifter debuted on 7800, it not only had to compete with the NES's excellent shooters like Gradius and Section Z, it also had to be this console's sole bulwark against revolutionary creations like Castlevania, The Legend of Zelda, and Metroid. That's a lot to ask from a once great but extremely dated arcade-style shooter from 1982. I mean, this is a strong adaptation, but single-handedly counter the entire NES library as the system entered its prime strong? Let's be realistic. Fittingly, to mark this brief transition from arcade conversions to PC ports, a new developer makes its 7800 debut, Ibid Inc. While lacking the legacy of an Atari or a General Computer Corp, Ibid Inc. did some respectable work here. though the company would evidently go under after producing just 3 7800 games. Oh well. Also from Ibid Inc., we have a conversion of Jordan Mechner's martial arts cinematic classic Karateka. Now, I've covered Karateka before on Game Boy Works, but that video was made about 6 years ago, so a refresher is probably in order. In Karateka, you play as an unnamed martial arts warrior who sets off to fight his way through a bunch of goons in order to rescue the Princess Mariko from the evil warlord Akuma. Not the most imaginative plot, but at least it was presented stylishly. Rather than simply appearing as a text scroll before the action begins, Karateka's storyline plays out as you play. Inspired, obviously, by classic Japanese films, the game drip feeds plot developments as a reward for besting each new foe. This came along half a decade before Ron Gilbert coined the term cutscene for Monkey Island, but that's what these are, cutscenes. Mariko despairs, Akuma commands his minions to go after the Karateka, and so forth. The progressive narrative paired neatly with the game's fluid character animation and detailed Japan-themed backgrounds to present 1984's Apple II fans with the most engrossing plotline yet seen in an action game, despite not containing a single word of dialogue. The task of actually seeing the entire story played out demanded much of players, though. Karateka is an enormously difficult game, small in scope but with such high barriers to progression that completing it requires a huge amount of practice. It's a game I revisit from time to time, yet rarely see anything beyond the third enemy. This is a proper martial arts combat game, one where you can't just spam the attack button to win. Your warrior can punch and kick, and each attack can be altered to aim high or low. Each type of strike has its own wind-up time, its own reach, and its own combo potential and cooldown time. Your enemies are basically every bit as capable as you, and they advance in seemingly endless numbers to attack you one-on-one. Your aim is to reach Princess Mariko while fighting as few bad guys as possible. This means you need to run forward into Akuma's fortress as quickly as possible between encounters, though you can't make too much haste, or you run the risk of going down to a single blow. Your Karateka can take two different stances, combat and neutral. You move slowly in your combat stance, but a strike from an enemy will only dock you a single point of health. Whereas you can run quickly in your neutral stance, but take a single hit and you'll go down instantly, game over. So knowing when to shift stances and remembering to make the shift is critical to play. Far more challenging to come to terms with are the controls for this version of the game, which feel bizarrely complicated after having played the Game Boy release. Rather than mapping punches and kicks to the 7800's two buttons, Ibid Inc. instead decided to make use of combination inputs here. There's a button dedicated to simply shifting stances, while punching and kicking requires you to press the joystick either forward or backward while hitting the attack button. Which means that if you want to attack high or low, you also need to hold back or forward, plus up or down, while also pressing the attack button. As with Xevious, it feels like a point was missed somewhere along the way. The 7800's two-button controller should have allowed for more intuitive and less baroque input schemes than were necessary on the 2600's one-button controller. And yet, here we are. The cumbersome control scheme, which is reminiscent of Data East's Karate Champ, makes this conversion of Karateka much less friendly to play than you would hope. It's a shame because this was one of the final US releases of a groundbreaking computer game. It deserved a better send-off. And from developer Computer Magic, the final game this episode, OneonOne Basketball. This, of course, is another computer classic, a conversion of Electronic Arts' groundbreaking licensed sports game, OneonOne, Julius Erving and Larry Bird. Rather than attempting to map the complexities of full-court team basketball to the limited hardware of 1983 vintage computers like Apple II and Commodore 64, OneonOne instead stripped things down to the simpler approach indicated in the game title. Players faced off against either the computer or another player on a half-court, competing directly to reach a target score or hit the most baskets in a set amount of time. We've seen this exact concept recently on Game Boy with Jaleco's In Your Face. This, however, is the original. OneonOne was a revelation at the time of its original debut for boasting the likenesses of two giants of the sport. Not only that, but Irving and Bird consulted on the game itself, providing feedback to EA to help create a more convincing simulation of the sport. The limited focus of OneonOne allowed its programmer, Eric Hammond, to focus more heavily on simulating physics, providing a massive suite of play settings and options, and generally bringing an arcade-style experience to computers while enhancing its design with the depth players expected from a computer game. And this conversion is pretty good. It looks a little nicer than the original, but it seems to include all the little extras ranging from play options to the little guy who comes out to sweep away the glass when you shatter the backboard with the force of a particularly impressive dunk. While I'm tempted to repeat myself and say this would have been a system seller had the Atari 7800 launched in 1984, I'm not so certain this would have shown up on day one. It wasn't developed by General Computer Corp, who are reputed to have programmed all the launch titles for the system. So it's possible this may have been one of the first proper post-launch creations and releases for the console. And it's still pretty respectable in 1986, even if its stars were no longer quite marquee draws. Dr. J and Larry Bird had begun to feel like the old guard in the era of Michael Jordan and the ascendant Detroit Pistons, though they still had plenty of name recognition. Likewise, the game itself looked and felt a little dated, but not unbearably so. OneonOne's October 1987 release date means it showed up at retail a few weeks after Konami's Double Dribble for NES, and a few weeks before Sega's Great Basketball for Master System, both of which had a more contemporary look and feel. Still, the NES and Master System games were full team sims, which meant OneonOne's head-to-head directness set it apart, at least until Jaleco shipped Hoops for NES a year and a half later. You know, Hoops, the direct antecedent to In Your Face, and a game blatantly patterned after OneonOne. Like Jaleco's games, OneonOne works a lot better in multiplayer, as two human players are far more evenly matched than the ruthless CPU, which plays flawlessly even at the lowest difficulty setting. But that's okay because this is my favorite kind of sports game, the kind where you can set the computer to play itself in an exhibition mode, and I don't have to try and produce footage of any high-quality gameplay myself. And with the release of OneonOne Basketball, the Atari 7800 release chronology is now caught up to where we are with NES Works, January 1988. Atari would ship only one game for the 7800 between October 1987 and August 1988, so we'll check in again with the 7800's progress in about 15 episodes of NES Works from now. Of course, there's still the Sega Master System release chronology through January 1988 to work through, and that's going to take a lot longer to get through than the Atari 7800 did. There's going to be a whole lot of grid patterns, so brace your eyeballs and get ready.